Hi and welcome to Ancient Egypt. Not really, it's Jessie James Beads. Hi, my name is Jem and today we're working with the October Magical Mystery Bead Box, which is Ancient Egypt. Let's head down to the board and we'll take a closer look at the project we're going to make together today, which can be used as an earring or indeed as the central part of a lovely chain bracelet. Now this October 2025 Magical Mystery Bead Box may indeed get my vote for Box of the Year here at Jessie James Beads. My name is Jem and I'm obsessed with Ancient Egypt. This is the project we're going to create together today, and I've stylised this around a cartouche. So you can use this as an earring, and I'll show you how to create this beautiful dangly section down at the base, or you can simply connect both of those links with a piece of chain to create a bracelet that will sit over the back of the wrist. Now it works really beautifully well with multiple beads from the Cleopatra bead mix from the October box. However, if you want that to be slightly smaller, you could use a different stack of beads if you prefer. There's plenty to choose from in this delightful mix. You could even go for just one of these beautiful twisty beads. Either side of that you can add in one of the gorgeous papyrus seed beads in that lovely gold shade. I'm going to show you how to create this with the beads that I've used in the section here so that I can create this as a pair of earrings, but equally, as I say, you could link those two sides together with chain and your choice of clasp to create a lovely bracelet centre. So let's pop that little one over to the side so it's out of the way. Let's talk wire. I'm going to use two pieces of 20 gauge wire. Today I'm working with Artistic Craft wire in 20 gauge in that beautiful gold colour. You can of course change the colours up. I tried this as an example earlier and the colours work beautifully with both copper and bronze, but you can totally mix those metals up. I have two 12-inch lengths of that 20 gauge round wire to work with today. And that's just because I had previously cut them and they were on my desk. 20 gauge is really the best gauge for this design. However, you don't really need 12 inches for the first part of the design. You could probably use a section around about 6 to 8 inches in length, but we're going to start with a 12-inch section. And the first thing I'm going to do is to just smooth and warm through at one end. Make sure that I have a nice flush cut on that end there. And what I'm going to do is to put a right angle bend about 1.5 inches from one end. You can use a set of round pliers, or you can use your multi-step bail makers, or as I am, you can use your memory wire finishing pliers. I use these all the time. So I tend to create this wrapped loop in two parts. The first part is to create the angle change and the first half of that round shape. Then I will bring that tail all the way around to complete a circular form on the end. Now if that doesn't sit completely centrally, I'm just going to close that up. If you plan on making this as the centerpiece to a chain bracelet, at this stage you could add in your chosen chain. Now I've already used all of the beautiful golden chain that came in this month's box in another project. So you can also use pieces of chain from a different box, or you can use one of the magnificent chain reactions. Just slide the last link in at this stage. Then what I'm going to do is just strengthen that up, smooth through the next couple of inches and start loading on my beads at the far end. So I'm going to start off by using one of the small papyrus gold seed beads. Now just occasionally a seed bead won't quite work on a round wire. These have all worked for me, but if you do get one that just doesn't quite go on, just pop that to one side and use it on beading thread instead. So one of those lovely seed beads from the papyrus mix. And then I'm going to use one of these outstanding washer style beads. I don't know what they're called, but they're lustrous. I could do with a whole chain of those. Then I'm going to use one of these wheel shaped gloriously golden orange beads, one of the lovely ceramic cylinder beads, and then I'm going to repeat that in reverse. So I'm using the same number and order of beads, just in reverse so that I get a completely symmetrical centerpiece. If you're making them as earrings, you don't need to have them symmetrical if you don't want to. Just needed to turn that round because I couldn't really see it. So let's slide that down to the middle. What I want to do here is to allow a good space either side of this little stack of beads, and I'm going to allow about 5 millimeters. That's less than 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch is about 6 point something, so we're not going to worry about it too much. What I'm going to do now is put another right angle bend on the other end. Just going to sharpen that up slightly and then bring back in my round nose pliers or my memory wire finishing pliers. Knock everything off the board, obviously. Bring that wire all the way around to create a circular form. Now I'm going to grip across that circular form and just strengthen it up whilst I make sure that that core wire is nice and straight. If you are creating this little cartouche design as the centerpiece of a bracelet made with chain, add in the chain to the other end of the wire. So the reason that I don't have this all sealed up at one end before I add the other end on is so that I can make sure that this design sits completely centrally. With the best will in the world, if I wrap 6 or 5 times around one end, when I come to the other end I may not manage to exactly guesstimate the distance that I need. So I tend to create this in 2 parts. Let's remove the other half of that wire now. So we're left with about 5 or 6 inches. So I would estimate about 6 to 7 inches of wire will be plenty to create this part of the cartouche design. So if you're adding your chain, you need to have your chain added into those loops at either end. I'm just going to give both of them a nice little squish. When I'm squishing this wire, I'm not squishing across where the wires cross over each other, only that round form. If you have a piece of chain in, you'll need to grip across that loop without squishing the chain. So the finer the tip on your flat facing pliers, the more easily you will be able to achieve that. So I'm just going to grip this as I don't have any chain, but you can achieve this with the chain in place. Your alternative is to use a jump ring or a split ring to add in your chain later, as you prefer. So I'm going to wrap the wire around the core now, and I'm going to wrap that as neatly and tightly as I possibly can. And I estimate to get around about 6 wraps of wire out of the 1.5 inches or so of wire that I left available on the end. I've wrapped 5 times at this end and I'm just going to leave it there for a second. I'll flip over to the other end of this cartouche design now, making sure that that loop is nice and strong. Now generally speaking, when I'm making bracelets or rings or pendants, I will use a heavier wire such as an 18 gauge or a 16 gauge because it's lovely and strong. However, when you're making wrapped loops with as many wraps as this, you are making quite a strong basis for your jewellery. So let's wrap at the other end as well, and we'll start off by wrapping the same number of turns. So I'm going to go for those 5 wraps of wire and see how much space I have either side of my beautiful papyrus seed beads. I'm just going to take a moment to make sure that everything is neat and tidy. If you have little moments that are slightly loose, we're going to cover over these wraps with some additional layers of wire later. So it's not super important to have that beautifully neat, but we do need them to be nice and straight. I think I'll probably be able to fit an extra half turn or quarter turn on each of those sides, because I quite like the idea of this being spinnable, so you can use this as jewellery that you can just turn and play with as you desire. Be careful when you're with seed beads that you don't crush the seed bead, because they can shatter if you smush them too firmly with your pliers. So I've got equal wraps on either end of my little cartouche base layer. So what I'm going to do now is to trim away as closely to that core wire as I possibly can, flip over to the other side and trim the other side away. Before you move on, it does pay to ensure that those ends are down as far as you can possibly get them to the core. So if I just tilt this in the light, you can see the cut end of the wire just here. So I'm going to use my pliers just to bring that down, again being mindful that I don't accidentally smush my seed bead. So just focus on where those pliers are meeting up, and if you need to use a magnifier, do feel free to do so. So that's our basis of today's design. We can still spin that cylinder. I think they're absolutely delightful. I'm going to bring in now my second piece of that 20 gauge golden colour artistic craft wire, and this again is around about 12 inches. I had some pre-cut 12-inch lengths, and I'm just going to grip hold of one end of those and give that a bit of a warm through, just to make sure that that's nice and flexible. Don't forget to warm through the end you're working with, and just trim away any ends that aren't quite flush cut or if they've been mangled in any way. So I'm going to just give that nice warm through to begin with. I'm going to lay that over the top of the wrap at the end of my cylinder segment, and I'm going to allow around about 1.5 inches again of wire. The tail of wire is going to rest just on top of the little spiral we created, and I'm going to bring the tail all the way around. So you find whichever grip works for you best. I tend to grip the cylinder with one hand and then use the extra fingers just to hold that wire over the top. Bring the tail around. Now it will wiggle just a little bit until you get that first wrap into position, but you'll see that I can pull that very gently so I'm not disturbing the straightness of that cylinder segment. Bring the tail all the way around, and I'm looking to wrap over the top of that first little spiral we made. Now if that does open up in any way, do take a second just to close that tightly before you continue. So if we just flip that over to the other side, I can draw those spirals together, again being mindful of that seed bead, before I continue filling in the gaps. So let's take that over the top. Now if you've got 6 turns of wire on the first layer where we created that wrapped loop, you're likely to only get 4 or 5 wraps on the next layer up. That's absolutely fine. That's what we're looking for. So I'm going to truncate the wire as neatly as I can against the core, and very softly just press that tail down. Flipping back to the top of the design, we're now going to load on some beads. So I'm going to start adding in some of those beautiful papyrus seed beads onto the end, but because I'm very slow at loading beads, I will join you back in a second when I've got around about 1.5 inches to 1.75 inches of this tail of wire loaded with these little seed beads. I've loaded 21 of those beautiful papyrus golden seed beads onto my wire, all from the October Magical Mystery Bead Box at Jessie James Beads. What I'm going to do now is take note of where my wire that bears these beads is coming from, and that is on top of that core wire where we've got those loops created. So what I'm going to do now is to gently start curving this around in an arc until I bring that to the equal and opposite side. So the wire bearing these small seed beads sits just at the end of that little spiral we created, and before we get to the seed bead that's actually loaded on the core of the design. I'm going to lay that fine wire with the seed beads over the top so that it sits in exactly the same symmetrical position, just between the spiral of wire from that wrapped loop and the seed bead that sits just outside the big golden washer. So I'm going to pinch that into position, draw that tail of wire all the way around as tightly as possible, and then bring that out to the side, and that is one side of the cartouche complete. So I'm going to repeat the exact same thing now with the tail of wire, giving that a little smooth through, because as we've wrapped the wire tightly around the core, it means that we are going to just add a little work hardening to this piece of wire. So I'm now going to add on some more of those beautiful papyrus seed beads, and I'll start with 21 and see how that looks. I've added 23 of those papyrus seed beads onto the second side, and it just seems to fit really nicely, giving the visual of it being equal, because that wire is just a tiny bit further away from that centre point. So I'm going to ensure that those beads are all snuggled up against each other, and then bring the wire, which has travelled from the top of the core around the side to the top of the core. Sit that into position so it's just past the wire that leaves with the first row of elevated beads, and draw that tail all the way around over the top of the previous wrap. So I'm going to take that around 3 times, and then we're going to flip to the rear of that design and trim the excess wire away. And we're going to use that tail in a moment. Now very, very gently just bring the last little bit of wire down so that it sits as neatly as possible and won't catch on skin or clothes. So let's just assess what we have. I think that little cartouche design looks quite charming. Either end can be added to a piece of chain. You could even have that as a pendant as well, but I'm going to show you how to create it as a pendant or an earring. So I have around about 3 or 4 inches remaining of that 20 gauge round wire, and I'm just going to get rid of that last little bit. And that was the bit that we just cut away from wrapping, so it gets a little bit work hardened. So I'm going to run that between thumb and forefinger to ensure that that is beautifully smooth and soft. And again, that's about 3 or 4 inches of wire. I'm going to bend that in half with a really nice tight bend up at the top. I'm going to strengthen that bend of wire and just gently bring them together. And then we are going to feed that through one of the loops. Now, if you have a preferred loop, then you can choose which one you want to put at the bottom. And if you're matching them as earrings, you'll see that this design has the thicker wrap of wire at the top and the thinner wrap of wire at the bottom. So we're going to match that. So this has been elected the lower wrap. I'm going to thread that little pen through the loop at the bottom. And then I'm going to add on one of those beautiful bead caps. And you'll find that the tails of wire will both fit through that really easily. I'm just going to push that up as far as it will go. So that sits up against the loop. And then we're going to find one of the round beads and push the wires through that hole. So both of those wires will fit inside this beautiful frosted bead, and push that bead as far up inside that little bead cap as you can, making sure that they look as similar as possible. So if you have a little bit of space, allow a little bit of space on the second one. If there's no space, there isn't here, then push that all the way up. So I'm going to elect which is the rear of my design, and the way I'm going to do that is by looking to see where the wire that bears the seed beads sits on the surface. So that would be the rear side of the design, that would be the front of the design. It's a very, very small thing to pay attention to, but if you're making those as earrings or you want them to match for whatever reason, then you do need to have the same number of beads and to ensure that you're looking at the same face. So once the bead cap is pushed all the way up against that loop at the bottom of the earrings, I'm going to draw those wires sharply towards the back of the design, like so. So you can see that's just a little right angle at the bottom, and then I'm going to trim away that wire just inside the bead cap. So it's quite a small distance of wire that's just here, and all we're going to do is to push that using the outside of your pliers just up against the bead, and that then acts as a holder, stopping the bead cap from coming off. It's quite festive as well. It looks like a little bell. Even sounds a little bit like one. So all that remains is to decide whether you want this to be a pendant or whether you want it to be an earring. So I'm making them as earrings. Let's put that through. Again, taking a moment to think whether your earring finding is on the correct side of the design, so that when you close that up, the front bit comes forwards when you wear them. So this was the Ancient Egypt October 2025 Magical Mystery Bead Box from Jessie James Beads.